Welcome to all of you as you're settling into the space. Today is the third day of Creighton University's National Public Health Week celebration, as you see on our shared screen. I want to remind you as we get started, we will be recording so that this is available for those who were not able to join us today, or if you're really excited and need to listen to it again, it'll be available on our website. So my name is LaShawn Johnson. I'm a faculty in the NPH program, and I'm a member of the planning committee for Creighton's National Public Health Week. This theme for this week is building bridges to better health. And all week we've been working on and talking about the expansiveness of public health, which goes beyond healthcare, and it includes things like education and housing, like we'll see today, the environment, infrastructure, criminal justice, and all kinds of things. And this week we're also making an effort to make public health more inclusive. So welcoming people from diverse backgrounds, life experiences, and identities. So on Monday, we were really lucky to have Dr. Anthony Robbins sharing some experiences about climate justice among African Americans. Yesterday, I was really fortunate to speak with my colleagues about community engagement and developing dialogue. And today, we have Pierce, Erin, and Danni talking to us about their research around evictions during COVID. So we're happy to have you all joining us and using your lunchtime or another part of your workday to listen to us and learn from us. And so we're really hopeful for a rich and engaging conversation. So we cannot start a session about housing and home without taking a moment to do a land acknowledgement. So I want to say that I want to pause to acknowledge that our university is near the home of the Omaha, Winnebago, Lakota, Ponca, Iowa, Santee Sioux, Sac and Fox, and many other tribal communities who have cared for this land, that is their home, throughout the generations. We thank them for their perseverance in protecting this land, and I personally endeavor to uphold my responsibility to this land according to their example. So before we turn it over to Pierce, Erin, and Danni, again, I just want to remind you that we are recording. As you're thinking of questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. Terry and Monica and I will be monitoring the chat and trying to keep track of things. So at the end of the session, we'll be able to try to get through as many questions as possible. If you're not speaking, please mute yourself. Please don't feel obligated to share your camera, but we would love to see your smiling face if you are speaking. And Monica, I guess we can take this slide down. And again, welcome from the Creighton University NPH program. We're so glad to see you. We're so glad that you've taken the time with us. And I am so grateful to introduce our colleagues, Erin, Danni, and Pierce. Thank you.
All right, thanks, LaShawn. I really appreciate that introduction. So I'm going to be talking today about a report that Danni and Erin and I, as well as a student here at Creighton, Emily Burke, put out a couple of weeks ago, tracking evictions in Nebraska during COVID-19. And I wanted to take a moment to talk a little bit about our partnership. So last July, we came out with a report specifically focused on Omaha, titled Understanding Evictions in Omaha. And we collaborated with Family Housing Advisory Services and Gary Fisher on that report. And after that, we were involved in a lot of community conversations about eviction. And that report looked at, we had started long before COVID and looked at evictions over an 8-year period in Omaha. But we didn't have anything to say about what was going on in Nebraska during COVID-19. And so we sort of asked around and found that Together was also collecting data on this, and that this would be a good opportunity for us to partner, for us not to duplicate the things that we were doing, and to overall just sort of help to fill this gap in knowledge about local eviction data. So a few things that we're going to talk about today is I'm just going to talk briefly about evictions, why they could be considered a public health issue, then move into some of the outlines from our report. And then I'm going to turn it over to Danni, who has really done extensive work looking at Douglas County and really diving into some different details of things like geographic and racial disparities and housing quality evictions here in Douglas County more specifically. And then we'll kick it over to Erin to talk about some of the legislative efforts and local efforts, trying to answer that question of what can we do about this issue. So just to start off, how could evictions be considered a public health issue? Well, one thing that's really important that different sociologists and other academics have made the tie to is that eviction can serve as a cause of poverty, not just as an effect, and also serve as a cause of homelessness. In that people don't just get evicted because they fall on hard times, but once they do get evicted, that can be really hard to recover from that. Also, the mark of an eviction on your record can leave people really prone to exploitation. So if you think about someone's living situation, if there are certain places that won't rent to you because you have an eviction on your record, then you might have to settle for housing that is substandard, which can have an impact on your health. A forced move in general comes with loss of possessions and people's properties. For children, it can mean moving schools. There's all kinds of disruption that contributes to despair and mental health issues as well. We can't really talk about evictions without talking about the implications for equity and justice. Eviction involves the most vulnerable members of our society, and we have to consider that in having this discussion. It also disproportionately impacts people and neighborhoods of color. This is not a problem equally faced by everyone, right? It does concentrate in certain areas. And we'll talk about this a little bit more as we go along, but the eviction court process too, we sort of contend, and the folks at Together have a lot more perspective on this, that it's an uneven playing field. There are all kinds of inequities that occur within the legal system around evictions too. And during COVID-19, all of these impacts are intensified. Eviction can force people out of their homes and into living in shelters, or maybe moving in with other family members. And that, of course, is less conducive to social distancing during this pandemic. And some studies have found that cities with fewer eviction protections during the pandemic have actually had increased COVID cases. And when we think about health and comorbidities and the different populations that are more likely to have those comorbidities, it's the same populations that are disproportionately experiencing eviction. So the first foray that we kind of wanted to make into this topic was sort of a bird's eye view of the trends in evictions in Nebraska during 2020 and comparing that to recent years. And we also wanted to dig into the data on legal representation and what I'll talk about a little bit later, these potentially unlawful evictions, to highlight some of the issues with eviction court in Nebraska. So in 2020, our research found that eviction declined fairly substantially. I think percentage was 44%. This graph over here shows in Nebraska, Douglas County, and Lancaster County. In each of those areas, evictions declined. But of course, some people think that, oh, that's good news, there were fewer evictions, but this is actually troubling, I think, to a lot of folks in that it suggests there's a lot of pent-up evictions that might occur should some of the protections that are in place expire as the pandemic wears on, or eventually some of the restrictions and things start to ease up. These numbers also reflect a really large effort on part of nonprofits like Together and other organizations here in Omaha and across the state that have provided rental assistance. Also, federal government has provided rental assistance. And so again, when those things taper off, we're worried about a wave of evictions that might be coming. These numbers also reflect 3 different moratoriums, a state moratorium that prevented evictions sort of early on in the pandemic, the CARES Act moratorium, which is at the federal level, and a CDC moratorium that replaced that, which is currently in place, I believe was just extended to the end of June. So in thinking about evictions as a public health issue and during the pandemic, we put together this chart looking at the number of eviction filings there in blue, and this is for the whole state, and the number of COVID cases in red, as well as identifying where those state moratorium and the CARES Act moratorium took place. And you see early on in the pandemic, during the state moratorium, that there was a big drop-off in evictions. But after that sort of first and second month, you start to see evictions creep back up. And from a public health standpoint, this seems a bit backwards because, if you're putting in a moratorium to prevent evictions for public health reasons, you can see here that the strongest moratorium, or the strongest reaction to moratorium, was at a time when there were the fewest COVID cases in Nebraska. And we look at towards the end of the year, and actually in December, eviction filings are almost back to a normal level at a time when the pandemic is almost at its worst point. And so we thought this was important to point out. In terms of issues related to eviction court specifically, we looked at how many people in eviction cases had legal representation, which is something we had done a little bit with our prior report on Omaha too. And we found that in 2020, only around 4 to 5% of people being evicted had legal representation. And that actually represents an increase from 1 to 2% during a normal year. So in thinking about the different legal issues and procedural justice issues around evictions, I think Danni was doing some research in Douglas County and found that 100% of landlords had legal representation compared to just this small percent of the people facing eviction. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later and some potential policy solutions for that. And then another example of why that legal representation could matter is we undertook a really extensive coding process to try to identify potentially unlawful evictions that took place across the state. And overall, we identified 60 potentially unlawful evictions across the state, and 40 of those were in Douglas County. And to do this, we had to do 2 different things. We had to see whether an eviction address had a federally backed mortgage that participated in another federal program that would have made that property protected under the CARES Act. And then we had to open up that case file to see whether the eviction was for non-payment of rent. So this is a pretty stringent set of conditions applied to looking at these. And ultimately, we looked at 1,600 addresses in this way and found that there were 60 cases in Nebraska where the renter could have been protected under the CARES Act, but without representation, potentially without knowledge of navigating all of these databases online that you have to do to see whether the place you live is protected, that these slip through the cracks. And I haven't really compared this or seen any other states to know whether this is a high number or a low number, but I think the fact that this is happening at all is worth noting and just underscores some of the issues with legal representation. So that was kind of our big statewide bird's eye view of kind of what's going on. But I'm going to kick it over to Danni to talk more about what's going on here in Douglas County. And this is some information she's been working on for a really long time and been living and breathing this data that brings up some other topics and issues that are important. So Danni, if you want to take it away, I'll just sort of click through the slides and try to go along with what you're saying.
Sure. Thanks, Pierce. So as Pierce said, I'm Danni Smith. I am the research and evaluation specialist at Together, and I have spent most of the pandemic researching eviction trends, mostly in Douglas County. I was actually approached by legal aid during the CARES Act moratorium that happened last summer, because they were looking to help identify some of these unlawful eviction filings, and they weren't entirely sure how to go about that. So they were actually able to send us a lot of the addresses where evictions are going to be happening, and we were then helping look those up and see whether or not they were lawful, and just trying to give them some background on the properties where we could. So just as a basic overview of what we saw in Douglas County last year, there were at least 3,208 residential eviction filings. So 57% of those cases ended up in an eviction. What happens if you have an eviction filed against you is that will be a court case that's opened up, and then you would have to go to court and they will decide whether or not you have an actual eviction judgment. So if you receive an eviction notice, it doesn't automatically mean that you are actually evicted. So in total, we saw that there were about 1,800 eviction judgments in Douglas County. And it's also important to note that does not include self-evictions, which happens when the person makes a decision to preemptively leave before they can be evicted formally by the court. And they may choose to do that either just to avoid the court process or also to have that not have an eviction judgment on their record. There are various reasons why someone might do that. So when we multiply out that 3,200 residential eviction filings by the average household size in Douglas County, we can conjecture that more than 8,000 Douglas County residents faced eviction last year alone. That number would most likely include at least 1,000 children. So for my fellow public health people out there, that would be a prevalence rate of about 4,600 eviction cases per 100,000 renter population. And also, before we move on, just to specify that about 86% of eviction cases in Douglas County last year were for non-payment of rent. So evictions by property type is an important thing to consider when we're looking at which properties or which renters and what types of properties may be more vulnerable. This is important because we actually saw disparities in the eviction outcomes last year in Douglas County. So for example, as we said before, about 57% of eviction cases resulted in an eviction judgment for all property types. But in some types of housing, this was a bit lower. So among public housing tenants, 46% of cases resulted in an eviction. However, we also saw this be a lot higher for some of our very vulnerable tenants in the community. So among tenants living in supportive housing, so this category, I included things such as assisted living for seniors or persons with disabilities, chemical dependency treatment centers, transitional housing for people coming out of homelessness, those sorts of centers. Those people living in those places who had an eviction filed against them, about 70% of cases resulted in an eviction judgment. So that was a lot higher even for people who are very vulnerable. And these evictions by property type we found also varied quite a bit from county to county, and it just sort of gives us as well a snapshot of where renters are living in different communities. So when we look at geographic and racial disparities within Douglas County, we see the greatest disparities in North Omaha, which has, as many of us know, has been the heart of Omaha's Black and African American community for a very long time. And we are also seeing newer Latinx and Asian American communities. We're seeing a lot of refugees in particular that are coming to this area. So we actually found that last year, there were more evictions filed in 5 North Omaha zip codes during 2020 than were filed in all of Lancaster County. Those 5 zip codes were 68110, 68111, 68112, 68114, and 68134. Which has historically not been considered a part of North Omaha, but we included it in our analysis because we are seeing more and more lower income renters moving into this area as a result of the displacement and the lack of affordable housing options that are happening in North Omaha. As a result, we're now seeing evictions in code cases that are very similar to the levels in other neighboring North Omaha zip codes. So we see when we look at the distribution of residential eviction filings in Douglas County last year, North Omaha actually represented about 40% of all cases in Douglas County, those same 5 zip codes we mentioned. And it's also worth noting here that South Omaha, which we included as part of our analysis, the 4 zip codes that were 68105, 68106, 68107, and 68108. Those 4 zip codes made up about 20% of evictions. All of the other residential zip codes in Douglas County, and there are at least 20 of them, made up about 40% of eviction cases. So we can see that eviction cases really are heavily distributed into those areas specifically. When we look at this at the state level, it's actually even more alarming. North Omaha alone, as you can see in the graph, represented about 1/5 of Nebraska's eviction cases. North and South Omaha combined contain only about 10% of the state's population, but those 9 zip codes had about 30% of all of the eviction cases in the state. And if we look at that by land area, this means that 30% of the state's eviction cases occurred in just 0.08% of the state. We also see that eviction filings per capita are considerably higher in North Omaha. So across the state, about 1 in 50 renter households faced eviction last year. And in Douglas County, that rate was higher. We saw closer to 1 in 20 families had an eviction filed against them. However, in some parts of North Omaha, we saw eviction per capita rates reach as high as almost 1 in 10 renter families, which you can see right there for 68111. We also saw that eviction outcome rates were much higher in North and South Omaha. As many as 69% of cases ended in a formal eviction in 68111 in North Omaha, and as many as 63% of eviction cases resulted in an eviction in 68108 in South Omaha, again, versus 57% eviction judgment rate throughout the county. So essentially, this means that renters in parts of North and South Omaha are not only disproportionately more likely to have an eviction filed against them, but they are also a lot more likely to be actually evicted in that case. So in South Omaha, we actually did not see as large of a disparity as we did in North Omaha in terms of the eviction per capita filing rates, but this definitely still was a problem in South Omaha. So we actually saw that there were more evictions filed in South Omaha, those 4 zip codes that we mentioned, as there were more filed there than there were in all of Sarpy County last year. And it's also worth noting that there were some other issues faced by renters in South Omaha. So, for example, it might be harder to understand the eviction process. I think I didn't mention, but a lot of us know this has been the core of Omaha's Latinx population for over a century. So there are a lot of language barriers for many tenants who might be served with an eviction notice. It might be harder to understand the eviction process, to physically access eviction court, to get legal representation if you need that, or even to present your defense. And we also, anecdotally at Together last year, we saw that it was a lot harder for many families in South Omaha to access resources during the pandemic, such as unemployment or rental assistance programs, in the event that no one in the household or the adults in the household did not have a social security number. And we at Together also saw sometimes last year that it was much more difficult to distribute rental assistance funds even to landlords if the landlord did not have a social security number or a tax ID number. So same number of eviction filings as other parts of the county, but different issues there. So moving into evictions and housing quality, as you might have guessed by now, the majority of Omaha's code violation cases are happening in North Omaha and South Omaha. There are a lot of reasons for this, but generally in areas where there are higher poverty, there are more families in need of lower cost rental housing options, which essentially means that landlords acting in bad faith have an endless pipeline of potential tenants. And these tenants are often unlikely to complain about housing conditions because they do not want to risk losing said housing or having to experience retaliation. So it sort of ends up being a cycle of properties going into disrepair and tenants who don't feel comfortable making a complaint about that. So we actually looked up code violation records for every residential eviction filing in Douglas County last year, and we found that more than half of all properties had had a code case since 2017. So we were even more alarmed to find after that more than 4% of eviction cases had actually occurred in units where there was an active code case within 2 months or so of the eviction. And I am going to put in the chat right here. This is a link where you can look up code violation cases there. So we actually did the same thing with Omaha's rental registration ordinance. That was an ordinance passed in 2019, and it mandated that all rental property owners within the city of Omaha would be required to register their properties by March 31st, 2020. And then in most cases, that would end up placing them onto a 10-year inspection cycle. This was legislation largely catalyzed by the Yale Park disaster of 2018, which I'm guessing many of us might be familiar with, but if not, that happened in an apartment complex in North Omaha, and there were about 500 refugees who were evacuated by the city of Omaha because of imminent safety risks due to code violation cases. So as I mentioned, all rental properties in Omaha were supposed to be registered by March 31st of 2020. However, we found that among addresses where evictions had been filed, more than a third still weren't registered after that date. And a brief look here at who was filing evictions in Douglas County last year. So we actually saw that the #1 evictor in the county and one of the top evictors across the entire state was the Omaha Housing Authority last year. And then after that, we saw a number of large private local companies who were also overrepresented in eviction court. So these are many names that we might recognize from just seeing apartment listings near us. The Lund Company, D. Thompson, which is also known as Omaha's Premier Property Management, Landmark Group, OK Omaha. Landmark Group is also Dave Palladino, Selden Company, NP Dodge. And in total, we saw that the top 8 evictors in Douglas County had brought about a third of all cases in 2020. It's also worth noting that among landlords who had filed at least 10 evictions in Douglas County last year, they received a total of almost $22 million in federal Paycheck Protection Program funding. And that average award amount was $704,000. Just to give some context there, less than $10 million was allocated to rental assistance in Douglas County through the CARES Act. And in case you're interested in looking up Paycheck Protection Program funding for a landlord that you know, I will place that link in the chat.
Thanks for that, Danny. We'll kick it over to Erin to maybe talk a little bit more about Together's work on evictions and some of the possible things that are going on in the state legislature, but also here locally, and thinking big picture about what we can do about this. So take it away, Erin.
All right. Thanks, Pierce and Danny. Honestly, you all do most of the work, and I just shout into the void with all the things you give me. So at Together, if you're not familiar with us, part of our mission is to end homelessness. And to do that, we have to look at homelessness holistically. It's not just people who are street homeless. It's not just people living in a shelter. It's about housing instability and insecurity and ending that housing instability that's caused by the shortage of safe and affordable housing in our community. Each year at Together, we undertake a biannual survey measuring a sample of our food pantry clients' self-sufficiency across several indicators. And we've consistently found that housing stability is linked to all of these other metrics like employment, income, mental health, community engagement, support networks, and food security. So we know that stability and self-sufficiency depend in large part on housing stability. And if we believe this, then we also know that housing stability is linked to the stability of our larger community. We at Together also, we work on housing justice through policy and advocacy, because we know that we can have as many brilliant and effective programs with as much money as thrown into them as we want to run, but these will not effectively shorten the line or put a significant dent in homelessness and housing instability than if we paired those same programs with long-term solutions that are grounded in effective policy that reach a much larger group of people. At the legislative level this year, we introduced, a group of housing advocates introduced 13 different legislative bills aimed at the Nebraska Residential and Mobile Home Landlord Tenant Acts, and then 2 bills that were aimed at the Nebraska Fair Housing Act. So in total 15. And from that, we got a housing justice package encompassed in LB 320. LB 320 changes the Landlord Tenant Act by increasing protections against evictions for criminal activity for victims of domestic violence and abuse, increasing access to justice and balancing the scales in eviction court by working toward parity in the proceedings between landlords who currently hold almost all of the power in eviction court and tenants who at the end of an eviction become homeless. Now, it's incredibly important that we level the playing field in eviction proceedings. We know that an inability to pay rent is not just a failure to pay rent. It's not just a cut and dry situation. There are a lot of reasons that a person might find themselves in a situation where they just can't make it that month. And they are much more complex than they bought a TV, or they need to get a better job, or they're lazy, which are all arguments that we've heard about or against leveling the playing field in eviction court. We have seen examples where a tenant has paid rent and the landlord, perhaps not even with any bad intentions, credited it to the wrong account or just got the books wrong. One landlord even admitted to this in a judiciary committee hearing, and that tenant still got evicted. But without representation in court, without fairness in eviction court, I don't know how a tenant would assert their rights or their remedies, or know about their rights and remedies under the law. Like, who would believe them against a landlord attorney? And the vast majority of landlords are represented by an attorney in eviction court. We've also seen situations in the last year where landlords are granted continuances, which is rescheduling their hearing because they couldn't make it, like they had a dentist appointment, or really for any reason at all. Meanwhile, because a tenant must prove extraordinary cause to get a continuance, we have seen tenants be evicted even though they were in emergency surgery, because they had COVID, couldn't come into the courtroom, because they couldn't find childcare, couldn't take off work with such short notice, or maybe they weren't even properly notified of their hearing. So they find out they've been evicted without ever even knowing they had a court date. And I just to give you a good example of this, of the stark disparity in eviction court, we are the only state in all of these United States of America that has the extraordinary cause provision in our statute. So tenants must prove that they can't make their eviction hearing in order to get it rescheduled. And I listed some of those examples of why tenants have been denied rescheduling. Not only is this a justice issue, tenants don't have as many protections, they don't have the same access to remedies as do landlords, but it is a community issue because decreasing evictions will stabilize communities and decrease homelessness. The protections in LB 320 are incredibly important, and we need more legislative protections, such as a right to counsel in eviction proceedings, which was introduced this year, and we're going to keep bringing it back. Banning source of income discrimination in Nebraska's Fair Housing Act, so that people who receive any kind of housing assistance or any kind of government assistance have access to a much wider array of available housing. And we need to provide relief from an eviction record after a certain period of time. We see it together that one of the biggest barriers to housing stability is having an eviction judgment and even an eviction filing on your record, and being denied housing because of that. At the local level, I think that we all know that there is not enough safe, affordable housing in our community, which, as was pointed out earlier, in practice means that low income households are more often left with few options, but unsafe, unhealthy housing in neighborhoods that have been identified by HUD as racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. And just for kicks, research shows that people often pay more for substandard housing because they don't have as many options, because it is a captive market. And this is why we needed the rental registration and proactive inspection ordinance that City Council passed in 2019, because the complaint-based system that existed was inadequate to protect the very people who were most in need of the enforcement of minimum housing standards. It is one thing to pass an ordinance, and it is quite another to enforce it and ensure that it works. As was pointed out by Danni, people are being evicted from properties that are out of compliance with the most basic part of the ordinance, which is registration. By the way, registration is free. Just want to put that out there. And without the enforcement of that registration piece, there is no way for the proactive inspection piece, which is crucial to raising the safety and habitability of our affordable housing stock, to work effectively. So we're going to need some changes there. Now, during COVID, we saw evictions because what those of us who work in housing already knew. We saw evictions become what we already knew they were, which was a public health crisis. And we also knew that there were too many of them. And that the justification for the churning of this machine is specious at best. It is callous at worst. I cannot think of a single good reason in a well-functioning civil society that when every other courtroom was closed because of the danger of rising COVID cases, that eviction court remained open, packing people into courtroom 20 at 1819 Farnham just to kick them out of their homes. It is unconscionable, and it should make all of us pause and reflect on what that means for our community. Evictions are just one part of a much larger housing problem. They are not the start of the problem or the end of it. We like to paint evictions as the inevitable consequence of a housing market where you get what you pay for and you lose what you can't pay for. And to an extent, that is true, but housing is not just a commodity, because home is central to who we are, to our stability, to our community's stability, and to our safety. If you live in a place covered in black mold and with animals rotting in the vents, which we've seen in a complex in Benson, or with raw sewage in the basement, which your landlord addresses by telling you to just close the door, which we've also seen, and when you complain about it, you are at risk of eviction, which we know happens, then it's very difficult to function in the way that everyone expects of you. And if we are going to solve our housing crisis, we need to start from the foundation that having a safe home is not a privilege that is afforded to the few. It is a right that shapes everything about who we are. And we cannot achieve this if we continue to allow evictions to churn through the most vulnerable in our communities. So I just want to, I know this is a public health thing. Pierce and Danni are the public health people on here. And I just want to encourage everyone to get involved in housing justice, to get involved in advocacy, to always be talking about to your elected officials about the need for housing stability, about the need for housing justice in every single one of our communities, because it is not, although the majority of them are happening in North and South Omaha, there is a housing instability is touching every single neighborhood, every single place that we live. It's affecting the children in classrooms, your children's friends, it's your coworkers, the people who are serving you meals. And we cannot build a stable, healthy community if we do not first have stable and healthy homes. So I will get off my high horse, and I think we'll end it there, Pierce, and open it up to any.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, yeah, thanks so much. So I'll put the contact information for us up here, but I'd be happy to take any questions. And actually, you know, Danni and Erin, this is what they do on a daily basis. I'm kind of the numbers person. And so I really appreciate their partnership and consider this mostly something that, you know, it wouldn't happen without them. And so, yeah, I might defer questions to them based on what they are, but I don't know if Monica and Terry, if you were keeping track of questions or.
So Pierce, I think the three of us have been checking the chat, so there are some questions, but I want to start by saying how much gratitude we have for Pierce, Danni, and Erin for delivering such a timely and important presentation. I think that, as we mentioned earlier, public health is more expansive than just what happens in the health department, and at the hospital. And this was a really great introduction for some folks, or reminder for those of us who work in public health, all of the other areas of public life that are an important part of our well-being. So Danni, Erin, and Pierce, we had a question earlier from Rachel, who's an NPHW student. Woo-hoo-hoo. She asked, were there any suggestions for an improved eviction moratorium model that you might suggest that you've learned from other places or seen in other options? So that was one of the questions. I'll just give you a couple and you can decide which one you feel ready for. And Sharice asked a question about any sense of the landlord networks had the most filings relative to numbers of properties. So this is a numbers question. Was one network had more than others in terms of filings for their properties, right, Sharice?
Yes, or I guess I was thinking of citations and I said.
Okay. And also there seems to be a question about national trends around single women-headed households, and that came from June. So any of those to start with, and then we'll keep taking them as they go along.
I'll just jump in and take that first question about moratoriums and effective moratoriums. The biggest problem, and I know there are some legal aid and other lawyers on here who are working in eviction court, but it seems to me that the biggest problem we had with the moratoriums was that each and every one of them requires a proactive defense by the tenant. So under the CARES Act moratorium, a tenant would have had to know that the property they were renting was backed by a federal loan or had received subsidies under the CDC moratorium. And then they would have to be notified of their eviction hearing and show up at their eviction hearing, and then assert that defense at this, all in one thing, which just isn't happening. Under the CDC, they still have to assert their defense. And they have to go find a form and fill out the form. And then they have to, again, be properly notified of their hearing, show up to court, give that to their landlord, give that to the judge. And we have seen in eviction court that this does not always work, that landlord attorneys and judges have disputed the veracity of the impact by COVID, that kind of thing. So, ideally, to me, an effective moratorium would just assume that a non-payment case is probably at this point, a year into COVID, impacted by COVID, that we would just ban non-payment of rent cases. And if there are any landlords on here, please don't get mad at me, because canceling rent also includes subsidizing landlords to make sure that they're not losing their housing or losing money on this as well. But honestly, it would just be the default that we would assume that evictions should not be happening right now for non-payment, should not be happening because they are a public health crisis, and just wait it out and we'll get through it together. So an effective moratorium should also, though, be paired with, and we're seeing this now, with enough rental assistance or money set aside specifically for rental and mortgage assistance, to make sure that people aren't finding themselves in this situation, and also helping landlords as well to keep their income stable, so that they don't feel the pressure to evict someone for non-payment, so that they can make their own mortgage payments. So it's really a holistic approach to a moratorium that recognizes the disparities in the eviction court proceedings, and also just the disparity in power that is a landlord-tenant relationships, especially as it relates to low-income vulnerable tenants. And then I'll let Pierce and Danny take away the numbers.
Yeah, Danny worked on those numbers more. The other thing I would just type in and say about the moratoriums is that there are cases in other cities around the country where locally they've added moratoriums that sort of went beyond what was at the state level. So there are plenty of examples of probably along the spectrum, but certainly agree with everything Erin mentioned. So Danny, do you want to take the question? Sorry, I have it here. In terms of, the landlord networks relative to total property. We've talked about this before, Danny. If they all did the rental registration, we'd be able to see that, because we could see how many units each landlord has. But as of now, it's sort of a patchwork of looking at property records, which isn't units, and all kinds of stuff. Am I characterizing that right, Danny?
Yeah, I would say that's a fair assessment. The other thing that we see in terms of these landlord networks, a lot of the times they may be bringing eviction actions on behalf of their clients who actually own the properties. So an eviction filed by the Lund Company or Dave Palladino, they may not actually be the owner of that property, but they are the property manager, meaning that the owner hires them to collect rent, make maintenance and repairs, and evict if needed. So in a sense, they are still responsible for upkeeping that property because that's what they are being paid to do. But that's also a consideration in terms of who actually owns the number of units. In general, in terms of the eviction filings that we saw, larger networks tended to have more evictions. They also tend to have more code violations. Just makes sense given the larger number of units. However, the larger networks theoretically should also be better able to absorb the costs maybe of people not being able to pay their rent during the pandemic. They have larger, more diverse portfolios. You've probably seen a lot of like luxury apartments by Lund, and those tend to bring in really high rents, and they have a lot of those going on too. So They also tended to receive larger amounts of Paycheck Protection Program funding to help offset any losses due to COVID. And that was before even the rental assistance programs got rolled out. So yes, it is a bit hard to answer that question, especially since we don't really have a complete picture of who owns what, because a lot of people still haven't filled out the rental registration ordinance. And I would say that's especially true for some of our out-of-state landlords. So there were actually some larger, we have a fair amount of larger landlord entities from places like the Dakotas and California and Minnesota. So those entities, a lot of the times we've seen entire complexes not even being registered yet. So that's an issue that we see as well. The second question as well, I can go ahead and take a stab at that. So unfortunately, when evictions are filed, we don't have necessarily any information on the gender or the race of the tenant in the eviction case, whether or not there are children involved. However, anecdotally, we do see that single women head of household, that is definitely a big issue. I think nationally there is research to support that. And the other thing, if I can share my screen for a moment, I actually pulled this up just now. So this is a website called 211 Counts. And if anyone's not aware, 211 is basically a call center operated by United Way that people can call in and say, I need help with this, and they can help direct people to resources. So this is just since the beginning of the year, the number of people who have called 211 in Douglas County for rental assistance. So we can see that there have been 3,074 calls. When you click on this little people icon, it will actually break it down in terms of age and gender. And you can see that almost 70% of callers for rental assistance so far this year have been identified as female. So that, again, it's more anecdotal, but I think it speaks a bit to the problem that we're seeing as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out, not sure we did verbally, but to check out the chat for information from Ryan Sullivan about the tenant assistance project, and also Talia Smith has some information on getting involved here in Douglas County. If you want to hand out, I don't know, Erin, do you want to say anything about those local efforts?
I mean, yeah, sure. The tenant assistance project in Lancaster County is, I think, largely responsible for that jump in legal representation that we're seeing in 2020. And Talia and her efforts and her team's efforts over at Omaha Tenants United, there are a lot of ways to get involved that do not just require you to be a lawyer. Like, I'm not a lawyer. Danni and Pierce are not lawyers. But there's a lot of ways to get involved and to just, I think one thing that COVID has done is highlight, and I'm not going to say the right word here, but I think kind of just the absurdity of the system that we have right now, and what it says about all of us, because I mean, this is what's happening in eviction court is being done in our names. Because that's how the American justice system works. So if you would like to start working on changing that, there are a lot, like they said in the chat, there's a lot of ways to get involved. And we're going to keep bringing housing justice legislation. So let us know if you're interested in helping support those efforts.
Hi, all. I would just second Pierce and Erin's comments about the chat. The chat is on fire. It looks like most people have logged on with their computer, so you should be able to see the chat. Want to say thank you to Talia and Ryan and a couple of other folks who've shared resources around housing, justice, and legal representation. This is something that exemplifies the work that we do in public health, bringing in as many partners and empowering as many folks to help us along our efforts of social justice. So we couldn't have modeled it better ourselves. So thank you for those of you who are sharing the resources and the opportunities to get involved. We are about 4 minutes left. Any burning questions folks have? One last question, maybe, if we have one, or if not. Oh, wow, I'm going to give people back like a minute or two of their time. So again, the Creighton University NPH program is so grateful to Erin, to Danni, and to Pierce for bringing this conversation to the fore in our community, especially during this week of National Public Health Week. Again, reminding us of the richness of the services and things offered in the community. Thank you for all of you in the chat who are willing to lend your voice and ask questions and share other resources. This is incredibly important, and you have no idea how much you might have helped someone. I'll remind folks that we're recording, and we will upload the recording onto our National Public Health Week website, which I put in the chat. So if you've forgotten a resource or forgotten to write it down, you'll be able to go to the recording in the next day or so and see it, and you can kind of look through. Again, Danni, Erin, and oh my gosh, there's Danni, Erin, Pierce. So I'm gonna also share their contact information in the slide that I put in the chat, because I realized the font might have been a little light for some folks to read. And so that's also there as well. They're I think open to questions or inquiries about the work that they did or their methods or the work that they see that needs to go forward. Monica, Terry, did I forget anything? Nope. So thank you all again. This is really terrific. This is such a great group, a great size. We're so proud to have so many of you here listening to this important information. And we hope if you're interested, you'll join us for something else in the week. We have a presentation about COVID on Friday, and we have virtual yoga on Saturday. And also tomorrow is policy day. So there are a lot of mentions about policy today. So if you're interested in thinking about it, making change in the policy level, we have some resources in our website this week about how to contact a local policymaker and do a letter just explaining something that you're interested in. So this is a great opportunity to do that as well. So again, thank you to you all, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks, John.
Thank you.